Good evening, everyone. Actually, we're here doing the classic now of Zooming this conversation. So actually, as we record, it's in the afternoon, and I'm here in our home on Protection Island off Nanaimo. It's good to be with all of you, and I'm sorry not to be there in person, but I hope you enjoy the presentation. I'm going to start now by sharing my screen. And I want to talk to you this evening about a bit of a historical perspective on the work that I do on Indigenous peoples' plant knowledge and use here in British Columbia, with somewhat of a focus on the Lower Mainland area where most of you are in the Vancouver Historical Society. So, first of all, I want to recognize the First Nations of this region, and especially the Lower Mainland, the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, on whose unceded territories Vancouver is situated. And here on the Nanaimo side, the Snuneymuxw peoples and the other Hokomaitnam-speaking peoples of Vancouver Island. Haichka, Haichku, and Giakasla, Tleko, Hawa, to all of the First Nations here in British Columbia. And thank you for caring for these lands for so many countless generations. I'm going to be talking a little bit about that and how people have looked after the plants of this area and tended the areas that we often think of as wild, but we could actually think of as tended and cultivated. Thanks to John and Michael and the Vancouver Historical Society members for your kind invitation. And I also want to extend acknowledgement to many of my colleagues who have worked with me over the years, linguists, archaeologists, and anthropologists, and my husband, Robert Turner, who's did a number of the photographs that you'll see, as well as his support over so many years working together out in the field here in British Columbia. I especially am grateful to the many, many friends and teachers from the Indigenous communities where I've worked, people who have taught me and welcomed me into their communities, and their patience and their kindness is just remarkable. And I feel so fortunate to have been a recipient of your kindness and generosity. Many of these people that are pictured here have passed away now, but they still are with me in my heart, and I'm always grateful to them. Some of the people who are still living, I will point out specifically Satlama, Joan Morris, and Celelia, Belinda Claxton. Joan is from the Lekwungen Nation and Celelia from Saanich. Mrs. Helen Clifton from the Gitcat Nation. Kimra Kludasi Okwalokwa from Qualicum, and her late partner, Clan Chief Adam Dick Quaxistalawatla, was a very dear friend who's been one of a major teacher for me and so many others. And Dr. Richard Umik Atleo from the Nuchanoth Nation. These are some of the people who are still with us, and I am in touch with quite often. So today, as I mentioned, because you're a historical society, I wanted to give sort of a historical perspective of plant knowledge and plant use. So I'll give a bit of an introduction, talk about paleoethnobotany, which is ethnobotany, the study of plants, relationships and uses of peoples in the past. Talk a little bit about the early peoples in Western North America, about some examples of plant use and knowledge from ancient times, and and then just quick conclusions. I put this photo of yarrow because it's a very important medicinal plant, not only here in British Columbia, but worldwide, perhaps the most important medicinal plant in all of the different medical traditions across the world, European and Chinese, as well as here across North America. An aromatic plant that is used for multiple purposes in medicine, from colds and sore throats to toothache, childbirth, and many other purposes. And a couple of references. Michael mentioned a couple of my books, and one that a lot of what I'm sharing with you this evening is based on is Ancient Pathways, Ancestral Knowledge. It's a book that was published in 2014, and it was my effort, my attempt to try and figure out for myself, for my own information, how did people learn all that they know? What I've learned from contemporary people, how did they learn this knowledge? How did they pass it on and exchange it over time and over space and over cultural boundaries? And so that's what that book is about. And but there are many other books in archaeology and anthropology, ethnography that talk about history. And these are some of them listed here that you would enjoy accessing if you're not familiar with them already. And just to give you a picture of what the area that we're covering, that I'm covering in this book, it's the area that I call Northwestern North America, from Alaska down to the Columbia River and east to the Rocky Mountains. And within that region, which includes where we are this evening, all of us pretty much, there are 50 or so different language and major dialect groups whose territories are found in this overall region. And also 12 or so major vegetation zones. And within those, of course, there are multiple different habitats and vegetation types. So that if you put those two maps together and think about the biocultural diversity that we have in this region, it's really astounding. You can see the map here of the biogeoclimatic zones in color just in the corner here, and you can see just the diversity that's represented by these major vegetation zones. So thinking about people and plants in the past, we know that some of the maybe earliest records of archaeological evidence of plant use go back maybe 15,000 years, which is more or less the earliest recorded dates for people entering into this area of Northwestern North America. And one of the earliest is the Manus Mastodon site at Sequim, Washington, on the Olympic Peninsula. We can find clues of plant knowledge and plant use through archaeological findings and also paleoecological findings, when paleobotany being the study of ancient plants, not necessarily associated with humans, but we know what plants would be growing in an area if we can get vegetation cores and do pollen analysis and so forth. There are also oral histories, which go back into deep time, although they don't necessarily have an exact time associated with them. Languages are also reflective of sometimes very deep knowledge of plants, especially if we look at the proto-languages or the very early languages that can be reconstructed from current languages. And then phytogeographical information, what plants are growing where and when. There are a few problems with understanding ancient plant use, one of which is that plant remains often do not preserve well, and they're only in certain locations where we can find ancient plant remains going back thousands of years. We can study pollen, which preserves relatively well, but the pollen rain isn't representative of the flora. It usually is for wind dispersed pollen species and not insect pollinated species. So we can only get a kind of a representation of what might be growing, what might have been growing there thousands of years ago. And archaeologists have often been, I hate to say it, but a little biased against plant use in this region. We think of northwestern North America as an area where people are hunters and fishers, and often plant use has been somewhat overlooked. And of course, many of the major archaeological sites where we might find evidence have been already destroyed or obscured. My friend Dana Lepofsky, who's an archaeologist and ethnobotanist, did a survey of the journal Arctic Anthropology and found these results, that only 1 out of 133 articles or papers in this journal was devoted to ancient plant use. And 43 papers talked about animal remains. And to some extent, it may represent a bias against women's work, because often women in these societies were the ones who were specifically associated with the processing of plant foods, and often the harvest of plant foods. Women were the ones, the major berry pickers, the root diggers, also the clam diggers. But they were the ones who processed the meat and fish as well, often. And we get it in the term hunter-gatherers, where gathering is kind of relegated as random plucking and picking, and it doesn't seem to have the same importance to it. So as a result of all of this, plants are drastically underrated in the archaeological record. Whereas plant materials and material culture is about 90 to 95% botanical products, but only a fraction of those show up in the archaeological record. We see them in here, this site in Kamloops, birch bark rolls going back a few thousand years. Here we have basket remains from the Hurricane Ridge obstruction point area of the Olympic Mountains, going back 3,000 years. But those are just a few examples of what should be many more. Nevertheless, there have been about 100 of different species of plants that have been identified in archaeological sites. The sites that are most likely to reveal plant remains are waterlogged sites where there's no oxygen, but it's been submerged in water, dehydrated or dried sites in deserts, and frozen or carbonized sites, so hearth sites where carbon remains show evidence of seeds or other plant materials, and frozen sites. As some of you probably know about Otzi, the iceman found in the Tyrolean Alps, was an example of a frozen archaeological finding where multiple plant remains were associated with the man. His clothing and his tools and his containers and so forth were all plant materials there. So we have newer, better techniques for identifying plant remains, and there are some people here listed who are well-known archaeobotanists who have actually recovered and documented plant remains in archaeological contexts. So Meltzer's book, First Peoples in a New World, is a really good general reference to how thinking about people as they entered a world that was largely covered with ice sheets in the northern half of the continent back at the end of the Pleistocene. And we know that the first peoples came into this area, as I said, about 14 to 15,000 years ago at the end of the Pleistocene. And the Clovis tradition was one of the earliest archaeological documented groups of people, and the points that they made are very distinctive. The Clovis points found in various parts of North America, including in our region. But this photo is from an area north of Austin, Texas. This is from Meltzer's book again. So we think about what kind of environment people would have been entering. And if you haven't been to the Beringia Center in the Yukon, you would enjoy that very much as historians. And so got wonderful exhibits, including some of early implements used by people, and also a good portrayal of what the mammoth steppes would have looked like with these large mammals that are now extinct. And we now recognize that people probably came across from Asia on the Bering Land Bridge, which was up to 1,600 kilometers wide at some points in the late Pleistocene, and may have traveled through a nice free corridor to the eastern side of the Rockies and kind of spread down through central North America that way. And then returning north up the coast later on as the ice melted. So that's one route. And the other is more recently suggested, the kelp highway, that people traveled by water, boat using people down the Pacific coast, following the kelp beds and some unglaciated areas along, reaching as far south as Monteverde, Chile, where there's a very ancient site that has a lot of interesting plant remains, including some marine algae. And of course, the environment in those early days would be rugged landscapes and sandy, rocky coastline, mountainous, lots of wetlands of various kinds, peat bogs and marshes, ponds and lakes, and probably a lot of grasslands and prairies, and just few islands of trees and forests here and there that were just starting to develop following being covered with ice, except for a few glacial refugia. But people would have come to this area, I believe, from what I understand, already with the significant knowledge of plants, and would have carried that knowledge with them from their Asian ancestry. They faced huge change, disturbance of various kinds, seasonal changes, a lot of changing sea levels, tsunamis, volcanoes. We hear about these in some of the traditional stories, even today. There's stories that talk about glaciers and stories that talk about lots of fire and floods and so forth. Julie Cruikshank's work talks about some of these ancient narratives. So people had to adapt. And we can tell from the stories that have common themes. Many of them relate to the food plants and times of famine. There's stories about times of famine, which I'll talk about in a little while. There's stories about, a lot of the stories talk about fuel and matches and how people used slow matches, how they kept fire enclosed in shells and that kind of thing. That probably was that they learned very, very early and maybe already carried that knowledge with them from Asia. And of course, there's reference to drying food and processing and cooking food. So the earliest peoples would have been few in number and probably quite mobile, traveling around, hunting these large mammals and also fishing, of course. They already had dogs, which they brought with them, and probably, yeah, camped, moved around the country. Coastal peoples would have had maybe wood frame skin boats rather than the dugout canoes that were developed later on after cedar became common on the coast. And we have no really direct record of use of plants, but they probably used dozens and maybe hundreds of plants for food, materials, and medicines. And some of the plants that we know are found circumpolar. So these species are found in Asia, the northern rice root. We know it was used as a food by northeastern Asian peoples called the sarang lily, used by the Ainu and a number of the other indigenous peoples in Asia. And the lingonberry, which is well known in Scandinavia, but is also found across northern North America. And these species, people probably would have been familiar with and would have used even as they were traveling across the northern part of North America. We know right here in British Columbia, there's a long history of plant use, and it's reflected in more recent archaeological findings. And even in here, my friend Willie Hans from Bella Coola is holding a digging stick that he recovered. It was floating around in the estuary of the Bella Coola River. And so that gives us sort of a window into the past, things like that finding. And it would have been used to dig up the root vegetables that the Nuxalk and other coastal peoples were using at the time, the silverweed and the springbank clover called taxus. And as I mentioned, these ancient stories that are recorded in different places around Raven bringing soapberries to the Bella Coola Valley, recorded by Thomas McElraith, for example. They have the common themes of food, berry picking, fishing, famine, the times before there were salmon common in the area, and fire, the use of fuel and slow matches. So for food, we can imagine what the plant resources would have been, the same as more or less as people were using right up until the last century or so, and so in some cases right to today, of course. Edible wild berries, greens, root vegetables, inner bark of trees, and even maybe the pre-digested plants like lichens from stomachs of caribou. Fuel, they would have used grass, dried moss, pitchwood for tinder, and different kinds of wood were known for being excellent for kindling or for smoking food or processing hides. People had a lot of knowledge about the individual characteristics of fuel and wood that's used in different ways for construction, particular wood for paddles and canoes, other wood for snowshoes, and other wood and woody materials for cordage and basketry. They would have used the grasses and sedges and herbaceous species for bedding, for packing, for weaving bags, and so forth. And they would have used the marine algae, the kelps, both for food and materials, as well as medicines, and all kinds of plants for medicinal and spiritual uses, like the yarrow that I mentioned earlier, plants related to the sagebrush, the artemisias. Several different species have a lot of medicinal uses. So for the Coast Salish peoples, who are the main linguistic group or language family group in this lower mainland area, they've lived here in the Salish Sea area for probably thousands of years. We know at least for the last 1,500 years or so, the Coast Salish peoples have been here in both the Lower Mainland and over on Vancouver Island, as far west as Port Alberni, and eventually as far north as the Newhalk people at Bella Coola. And of course, the Salish and language people spread right across as far east as Montana with the Salish or Flathead peoples of that area. So we have several famous archaeological sites, like the Glenrose site, southeast of Vancouver, that goes back to over 8,000 years ago. We don't know if the people living in that site were ancestors of the Salish people of today, but they might have been. And these early people had clovis spear points, and they used a variety of stone tools, cobbles, and so forth. They lived in semi-subterranean houses, not the cedar houses that we think of today. And they had winter villages, and they traveled around seasonally, as we can tell from remains from their camps. And they had to adapt to different sea levels over time, over generations. The sea levels didn't stabilize in this area until about 5,000 years ago. People would have learned a lot of what they know and practiced from observation and from watching animals. For example, watching geese eating the eelgrass and noting how the eelgrass grew really well after it was partially dug up and tilled and harvested by the geese. Or how bears break off branches of berry bushes, and that makes the berries more productive in the long run. Animals use plants for food and for medicine, so they would have learned about edible plants and plants that might be used for medicinal purposes as well. Beavers cut willows and other trees, and they would have noticed how after a branch is cut, you get some long, flexible withes growing from the end of a willow or a hazelnut or something. And these are really great for basketry or for weaving for nets and so forth. Bears scatter the roots around when they dig them, like the rice root granules here left after a grizzly has dug up an area in an estuary up the coast. Bears scattered berries around, and that's a way of spreading the species around. So all of these things people would have observed and watched over time and communicated about these things to others and experimented with them with themselves. And we know that they shared a lot of knowledge about tools and implements, stories, and so forth through their different kinds of social contacts, whether it's through intermarriage or even slavery or warfare. People exchanged knowledge, and there was all kinds of invitations, hosting and feasting from one group to another. And we know, especially for the Salish people, it was a common practice for a woman to marry a man from another village. So there was all kinds of final ties, as Wayne Suttles points out, across the Salishan communities. And that represents knowledge exchange. So new technologies were exchanged, and new foods, housing, leadership, and all of these, we see how that knowledge disseminated across cultural groups and across space. And Vancouver itself is what we could call a historical treasure trove. If we think of the Lower Mainland and the diverse habitats that it embodies even today, after most of it has been settled and altered by agriculture, but there's still residual areas where we get a glimpse of what the original rich habitats would have been like. So we start in the lower mainland area, what's called the early Pacific period, around 4,500 years ago, when we start seeing huge shell middens on all along the shoreline and beaches and so forth. And people learned to process and store surplus food, shellfish and fish, but also plant products. And people were able to survive over the winter more and more on stored goods, which allowed the population to grow and allowed for a lot of technological development to flourish. So we have the Locarno Beach tradition that reflects all of this. The Marpole tradition, starting around 2,400 years ago, may indeed have represented the earliest Salishan peoples, or they may have been replaced by the Salishan peoples. We don't really know, but one culture seems to have shifted into another, going back about 1,500 years ago or so. But these are some of the evidence shows that the Marpole peoples were living much as the more recent Salishan peoples were, starting to build shed roof plank houses using a lot of shellfish and some sophisticated tools, and started to elaborate their art with beautiful stonework and so forth. Sorry, we'll go back there for a minute. Sort of the beginning of the classic Northwest Coast art styles, and also Northwest Coast ceremonialism is reflected in the Marpole tradition. And this shows the Marpole site. So, as I mentioned, the Salishan peoples, whose original homeland seems to have been the Lower Fraser Valley, according to linguists and archaeologists, really represents a huge area now with about 20 different languages, and probably originated somewhere around 3,000 years ago, spreading in all directions from the lower mainland, as I mentioned, down to the Spokane Kalispel, and Salish or Flathead peoples in western Montana. And there's the Newhawk little isolate up here on the north central coast. So there's a lot of interesting knowledge embodied in the names of plants. And Art Kuipers, who's a very well-known Salishan linguist from the Netherlands, did work on Proto-Salish and was able to determine a number of Proto-Salish terms that are reflected in the current names for these different plants. But Proto-Salish words were for cattails and scouring rush, for the spiny wood fern, stick for cone or nut or seed, quillaf, meaning an edible tuber, which I'll talk about more, quillin for birch, many more Proto-Salish words that would have been in the original Salishan language before people started branching out in all those directions. And then we have the European history, which you all would be quite familiar with, I'm pretty sure. Starting with in the 1790s, we see Fort Victoria, 1843, Fort Langley, 1827, and so forth. The city of Vancouver established in 1886. So this is only about, Europeans have been in this region only about 1% of the time that the Salishan peoples have lived in this area. So of course there were drastic changes when the Europeans arrived, different articles for trade and of course, the introduction of metal for tools and glass and that kind of thing. But also on the negative side, terrible disease epidemics were introduced, including a terrible smallpox epidemic that killed off many people in many different parts of the coast. And then, of course, the impacts that we hear about, especially today, from residential schools, taking over people's lands, territories, and resources, and all of the other impacts that people have experienced over the last several hundred years, but especially in the last century. But just to note that plants during all of these times of change have always been critically important. And although there have been a lot of losses, there's also been a major resurgence in knowledge and interest in language revitalization and in land reclamation and restoration. And so it's important to think about the positive aspects of people's knowledge and to support the continued transmission of that knowledge forward to the next generations. So from my work and others, we've identified about 200 different species of plants that would have been used for food, materials, medicines, and so forth. Some of them are very well known and others more specialized knowledge. But for example, some plants are not used at all today, like the bracken fern, whose rhizomes were an important source of carbohydrate to the musqueam in the early days. But the bracken were largely replaced by potatoes and other imported carbohydrates. Nevertheless, there's still oral traditions about bracken rhizomes that are found in a lot of the Salish communities today. And as I mentioned when I was talking about learning from animals, people learned how to look after the resources and how to actually enhance it and increase them both in volume and in productivity and in quality, so that they were able to use resources like cedar bark or cedar planks or berries without actually diminishing the overall populations of plants. And that's a key type of knowledge that is often not recognized when we hear the term hunter-gatherer. We don't get the understanding that people actually were cultivators and tenders of their habitats and plants. And we can tell from the way plant names are disseminated across dialects and across languages how much knowledge was shared across these groups. Just as one example, the coastal black gooseberry has a Proto-Salish name, tamach. And this name in various forms is found not only across the Salishan languages, like Comox and Shuswap or Sechelt, Squamish and Cowichan, Saanich and so forth, but also into the Wakashan family, where you have Kwakwala and Heltsuk, for example. These names were borrowed into that language family, and also the Nuchanoth and Tididat have borrowed versions of this name into their families. We have, going back to nearly 4,000 years ago, evidence of plant cultivation up in the Fraser Valley in the Katzie traditional territory. And there's been a lot written about this finding of almost a pure patch of Wapato intermixed with the ends of digging sticks. A really fascinating find that shows how people were cultivating these plants even nearly 4,000 years ago. And we have the names for the Wapato, showing with color coding the different relationships across the different terms. I'm not going to go into these in detail because we don't have very much time. But another one of the plants that is an ancient evidence of ancient use is the soapberry. And it isn't a berry that you just pop in your mouth and enjoy like you would a blackberry or a huckleberry. It's quite tart, and it has saponins, natural detergents in the berries that make it possible for you to mash them up with water and whip them into this amazing confection that's the soapberry whip. And the name for soapberry actually comes from the Proto-Salish word for foaming or frothing, huas. In all of the Salishan languages, all 18 Salishan names originally derived from this word. So we have squasum and husham, among other names in Salish languages. And what the Wakashan names, Nahuascan and others, also come from that Proto-Salish term. And then we have a whole bunch of other names from the Athabascan tradition. But it just shows how widespread the soapberry is and how culturally important it is. It goes back for a long ways. There are all the Salishan and Wakashan names for soapberry derived from the term huas, to foam or froth, swosum, swasum, and so forth. And then we have the Athabascan names that are likewise related and possibly even related to huas as well. Seaweed is another one that shows a long tradition of sharing of knowledge through reflection of the names. The edible red laver seaweed, which is really important on the coast even to today, has an ancient tradition of use, probably going right back to the kelp highway days. And you can see here from the color coding, all of these names and all of these languages from right up to the Chugach, Yupik, Inuit peoples, right down to Straight Salish and even further down into Oregon and Washington. There are variants of the same term, hlaask, hluk, hlukas, hlukasta, and so forth. So it shows, how much this knowledge has been shared across this area and how valuable this plant or alga is as a food. And then we have the camas and the onions. These two both have names in Salishan languages derived from the name that I mentioned, the Proto-Salish name for root or edible root or tuber, kohlal. And we have, on the one hand, the names for camas in the Straight Salish and even into Nuu-chah-nulth and Didadat and Quileute, all for the names for camas. And then in Squamish and Slatlimuch and Tlakatmuch, Shwetmuch, Okanagan, and so forth, the same Proto-Salish term is used for onion. So we have Kwalawa ul in Slatlimuch or Lillooet, the real original onion, Kwalawa and Kwaliwa, and so forth. We have skunk cabbage, which is widely used. It has big, waxy coated leaves. You don't eat them, but they're good for processing berries and drying them, as we see Quaxistala here with drying berry cakes with the leaves. And we see again two different derivations from the same Proto-Coast Salish term, kok, from all of these different languages. And then there's another term, timat, which you find in Nuu-chah-nulth and Didadat and Makah, on the west coast of Vancouver Island in the Olympic Peninsula. And then you find it again up in the interior with the Shuswap, Shwetmuk, Okanagan, Spokane, and the Salish way over in Montana with this, and Tanaha, which isn't a Salish language at all. So how did that name disseminate from between the coast of Vancouver Island and the interior as far east as Montana? It represents some contact at some point long ago in ancient times. And we have stories like the Cathlamet story recorded by Franz Boas in 1901 from the mouth of the Fraser River, how people long ago were dying of hunger. They didn't have any salmon, and all they had was skunk cabbage and wapato to eat. And then when the salmon arrived, they came and skunk cabbage spoke up from the bank and said, if it hadn't been for me, your people would have died a long time ago. And the salmon came up and found skunk cabbage, and they rewarded skunk cabbage with an elk skin blanket and a war club and set him inland and placed him among the willows. That's the story. There's a very similar one that is found in the Haida tradition up on Haida Kwai, where the salmon is associated with the skunk cabbage man is associated with the first salmon. And other intriguing kind of histories, I guess, we have hazelnut and white bark pine with the name Tsik, which is, as you might recall, the Proto-Salish word for seed or nut. We have these plants named after that. But if we look at the map, we see for hazelnut, there's a little enclave of hazelnut around Hazelton and the Skeena River up in the north, but most hazelnut comes on the lower mainland. So we look at the Gitxsan and Niska names for hazelnut, very intriguing, Tseka and Tsik. Those are very similar to the Proto-Salish name Tsik. Is it possible that people actually brought hazelnuts up to the Skeena River a long, long time ago? People from the north visiting the Salish, Proto-Salish peoples there? It's just a possibility. So many other stories and intriguing knowledge and wisdom. The wild rose, one of my favorite plants, has the greatest number of names in the survey that I did of plant names. It's named in all 50 major dialects and languages across the entire region. It's known as a famine food and is talked about in the ancient narratives, has many different uses as food, material, medicine, and so forth, and has a strong spiritual side to it as well. So just to conclude, despite all these changes over time, the First Nations still hold an amazing, rich knowledge. And often there are people within communities who, for one reason or another, trained by their grandparents or even great-grandparents, like Luce Cheam from the new book that just came out, Luce Cheam's Plants. And still we're able to retain this knowledge and to pass it along. There's still speakers of the languages, many of the languages here in British Columbia, and who are teaching the younger people, and there are a lot of younger people now picking up the language. And the social institutions and values and philosophies are still in place. And among those are people's deep attachment to their home places, their environments, and their plants and animals on which they and their ancestors have depended for thousands of years. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed this brief little glimpse into the history of plant use in our region. And Michael, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nancy. That was just a fascinating talk. And have a few questions and things coming in. One first with a comment. I'm hungry for berries now, and and to what extent do you reckon that food were the principal players in the diffusion of the food supplies?
I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, we often think of fish and game as being the primary foods for the peoples of the Northwest Coast. And in fact, they did probably comprise a good portion of the diet, but what's often not recognized is that plant foods probably contributed at least half of the calories and that people use and needed, and also some really important vital vitamins and minerals and other nutrients to people's diet, as well as providing dietary diversity. So berries really were and still are a major component of people's diets. And maybe of all the traditional plant foods that people have used in the past, berries are one of the foods that have never lost their popularity, and there's still people go out for them every year. And berry picking is a big, a really important activity, and one that children can take part in as well. Yeah. People don't necessarily make berry cakes anymore. Most of the time, the berries go into the freezer or into preserves of one sort or another, but they remain as important as ever, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and and you were mentioning the medicinal plants such as yarrow, and people will know that there's a little community, a little part of the Eastern Fraser Valley called yarrow. So just a very widespread plant out there, very, very common. Fascinated about the skunk cabbage. I knew it is one of the first plants that emerges in the springtime. And is it the leaves or the roots that they were harvesting?
It was the rhizomes, actually, the underground stems, which most people would just refer to as roots. Botanically, they're a little bit different, but the underground part of the plant. And like the skunk cabbage is in the arum family, so it's related to taro, which some of you will have heard of, and other plants in that family, including Dieffenbachia and philodendron. And these plants have crystals of calcium oxalate embedded in their cells. And so skunk cabbage, if you were to chew the leaves and swallow them, these crystals get embedded in your tongue and throat and actually could be quite dangerous. And a person that I know who for some reason decided to eat skunk cabbage thinking, oh, cabbage, I guess it's edible. He said it was like swallowing a cup of scalding coffee.
Oh, nice.
It burned his throat. And so the skunk cabbage rhizomes were specially prepared, and just like taro is specially prepared to reduce the impact of these calcium oxalate crystals. And they were usually cooked in underground pits. And have been for a long time.
Steamed and cooked for a long time. And it was fascinating, that idea of partially digested food in the stomachs of some of the ruminants that you would catch that would be full of food value, I can imagine. And speaking of berries, I can buy frozen Saskatoon berries at the little supermarket not too far from here.
Saskatoon berries, the city of Saskatoon is named after the Cree name for Saskatoon berries, because the Cree women, when the city was first being set up, the Cree women would go through with baskets of these beautiful berries, calling out Saskatoon berries for sale. And so they liked the sound of that so much, they named the city after it.
Yeah, yeah, it's a lovely idea. And you mentioned the soap berries being traded by the Chilcotin with the Nuxalt there, and I think all of us have heard about the grease trails that Ulukan trade that would have gone from the coast back up into the interior, and we follow these plants and the words from place to place. And what do we learn about indigenous histories hundreds of years later? You've touched on this, but it just sounds an incredibly rich history.
Yeah, just for example, not only the soapberry, and you can trace the names and so forth, but the seaweed, we can tell that the traded seaweed followed the same routes as the grease trails, because we have the names in interior languages for seaweed that was traded up up into the interior and on the east side of the Coast Mountains. And we mentioned also, just while I'm thinking of it, Wapato. I didn't talk about the name Hokol, which is the Musqueam and Coast Salish name for the Wapato, but also up in the Shuswap Lake area. My friend Mary Thomas talked about Wapato in the mouth of the Salmon River, and they call it Hokolos, which means jaundiced yellow eyeball. And or yellow round thing, I guess you would say, but it's the same. Got the Ols, which is the name for eye, and because you can actually translate the name in the Secwepemc language, it's almost an indication that that name spread down in from the interior down to the coast rather than the other way around. But that's only my personal observation.
No, yeah, it's just a fascinating way that people got starch and they got vitamins in their diet in the early spring with the very young leaves of things you couldn't otherwise eat as the season went along.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and you said 200 species of plants in use for everything, and that trade, and as I understand it, it was the indigenous trade routes that came all the way up from Mexico that it is said originally brought smallpox to the area before exploration and settlement. So, and I remember at one point being told that there was a particular flint that was used as a cutting tool that came from a particular place in the eastern part of that Salish and language group, over more into almost into Idaho. So, we just have, we're just coming to learn so much more about their about the range and the sophistication of their culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the different types of obsidian blades, you can actually identify the mountains that they came from.
Yes, and there's some obsidian, yeah.
Right. So from the Tahltan area have found their way down into the interior and even down the coast and so forth. You can trace these trading arrangements, but either people traveling long distances or going from one group to group through across different distances.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that you've really reinforced in my memory of this is that plants aren't just food. Plants are everything. They're
exactly.
not everything, but they're a comprehensive part of what we do. And if we think about the clothing that we wear now, well, most of it's plants. I mean, if it doesn't come from petroleum, then it's coming from plants.
Yeah.
One of the things that we had a lecture in 2016 by Dr. Douglas Harris at UBC, and he was talking about Kitsilano Indian Reserve, and he talked about this evolution of the ideas of property law, and that one of the reasons that the settlers, that the colonists gave that said that the indigenous people couldn't own their land was because they didn't improve it, that they didn't use it. But this is the kind of, what you're telling us is that isn't the case at all.
No, not at all. The thing is, they didn't have gardens like what I call Mr. McGregor's gardens. They didn't plant seeds and have rows of plants surrounded by a fence.
Yeah.
They cultivated perennial species. If you wanted to make a comparison, it would be more like orchards or growing asparagus or something like that. All of the plants that they used and named and harvested are perennial species that you can prune, or you can cultivate. You can grow from cuttings, or you can grow from bulblets and so forth. Mm-hmm. And so it just was, I'd say, conveniently overlooked by the newcomers. Yeah. That they did not, in one person's words, they did not occupy the land in any civilized way. Yeah, you know, exactly. So that the excuse to take over that land, and as a Lockean principle. And I'm glad you mentioned Douglas Harris, because I wanted to also mention Douglas' father, Cole Harris. It's one of the premier historians of this kind of First Nations and Indigenous history, along with also Barry Goff is a prime historian who's written about the Salish Sea area and some of this early history from the European arrival. So I just wanted to mention those two, and I'm glad you mentioned Cole, or Douglas, because he's also really has done some amazing research, especially around fisheries and fisheries knowledge.
Yeah, well, the idea that the past is known and now we look to the future, I think you're demonstrating with this that we know so little, and we're recovering, and the knowledge is carrying forward and so on, and being disseminated, and what could be, in a sense, more contemporary than being aware of the natural environment and not just the use of it. Can you, the final thing, can you think of that word of plant species that moved by people? It's anthropos something. There's this wonderful word that I've forgotten. And you know, you're talking about plants being moved by people into new areas. It doesn't matter. It was just
I can only think of anthropogenic, and that's not the same thing. No. But you're right. There is a word for people transporting plants and plant propagules from one place to another, and I can't think of it either. So,
but that's what we're talking about here, and it's just been absolutely delightful. And this is just, you've added to our knowledge and piqued our curiosity, and I'd like to thank you very, very much, and for speaking to the Vancouver Historical Society, and good night, and we'll keep in touch.
Okay, you bet. Thanks, Michael. I enjoyed it very much.